In the autumn of 1847, Massachusetts state investigators discovered something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Hidden beneath the rolling hills of what locals called Ellington's educational farm, they unearthed 43 small graves. 43 children who had arrived as hopeful orphans between the ages of 6 and 12, but who had never lived to see their 14th birthday. The official records claimed these children had been relocated to prosperous families heading west. The truth was far more sinister. For nearly 2 decades, Josiah and Constance Ellington had been running what appeared to be a charitable institution for displaced children, but behind the facade of education and moral guidance lay a systematic operation of exploitation so brutal that death became the only escape for dozens of innocent souls. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts buried this investigation so deep that even today, most historians have never heard of the Ellington farm scandal. Before we continue with the story of what really happened to those children in the hills of western Massachusetts, I want you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, because stories like this deserve to be told. And let me know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. I love connecting with fellow lovers of forgotten history. But what exactly happened on that isolated farm between 1829 and 1847 remains one of the most disturbing chapters in American industrial history, a chapter that reveals the dark underbelly of progress and the price paid by society's most vulnerable. The year was 1829, and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts was transforming before everyone's eyes. The Industrial Revolution had brought unprecedented prosperity to cities like Lowell and Lawrence, where massive textile mills churned out fabrics that clothed a growing nation. But with this prosperity came an unexpected consequence. Thousands of orphaned and abandoned children roaming the streets of these booming industrial towns. Factory accidents claimed fathers, disease took mothers, and the rapid urbanization left countless families shattered. It was into this chaos that Josiah Ellington, a 42-year-old former mill supervisor, saw an opportunity. Ellington was a tall, gaunt man with penetrating gray eyes and prematurely white hair that gave him an almost ministerial appearance. Those who knew him described his voice as measured and authoritative, the kind of voice that commanded respect in church pews and town meetings. His wife, Constance, was a woman of 38 with sharp features and an even sharper mind for numbers. She had managed the household finances during Josiah's years at the Pemberton Mill and had developed what neighbors called an uncommon understanding of profitable ventures. The Ellingtons owned a sprawling 200-acre property in the hills of Berkshire County, about 30 miles southeast of Pittsfield. The land had been in Josiah's family since 1782, when his grandfather had received it as payment for service in the Continental Army. Rolling meadows stretched between thick groves of maple and birch, and a clear stream ran through the heart of the property, providing water power for a small grist mill. To any observer, it seemed like an ideal location for raising children away from the soot and corruption of the industrial cities. The Ellingtons owned a sprawling 200-acre property in the hills of Berkshire County, about 30 miles southeast of Pittsfield. The land had been in Josiah's family since 1782, when his grandfather had received it as payment for service in the Continental Army. Rolling meadows stretched between thick groves of maple and birch, and a clear stream ran through the heart of the property, providing water power for a small grist mill. To any observer, it seemed like an ideal location for raising children away from the soot and corruption of the industrial cities. The proposal came at a perfect time. The overseers of the poor in Lowell alone were dealing with nearly 300 homeless children, housing them in overcrowded almshouses that bred disease and despair. The idea of sending these children to a wholesome farm environment where they could learn valuable skills while breathing clean country air struck officials as a godsend. Dr. Samuel Harrington, who served as the Inspector of Public Welfare for Middlesex County, would later write in his official report, "Mr. Ellington presents himself as a man of exceptional Christian character, well versed in the practical arts of agriculture and possessed of the patience necessary for molding young minds. His proposal offers these unfortunate children an opportunity far superior to anything our urban institutions might provide, but there were others who harbored doubts from the very beginning. Reverend Daniel Parker of the First Congregational Church in Lowell had interviewed Josiah Ellington when the man came seeking references for his venture. Years later, Parker would recall the encounter with visible discomfort. There was something in his manner when he spoke of discipline that gave me pause. He spoke of children as one might speak of livestock, useful, requiring management, and ultimately expendable if they proved unsuitable. When I questioned him about his methods of instruction, his eyes took on a coldness that I found deeply unsettling. Despite such reservations, the pressing need to address the orphan crisis overrode any concerns. The first group of children arrived at the Ellington farm in June of 1829. Among that first group was a boy named Timothy Caldwell, 8 years old, whose parents had died in a mill fire the previous winter. Timothy was small for his age, but possessed a quick mind and an eagerness to please that had endeared him to the charity workers in Boston. He could read simple words and knew his numbers up to 100, remarkable accomplishments for a child of his background. The caseworker who arranged his placement, Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, noted in her records that Timothy shows great promise and should benefit immensely from the rural education and moral guidance that Mr. Ellington's establishment provides. What Timothy encountered when he arrived at the farm, however, bore no resemblance to the pastoral sanctuary that had been described to city officials. The children's quarters were located in the basement of the main farmhouse, a damp, poorly ventilated space with stone walls that wept moisture even in the driest summer months. 22 children were crowded into a room meant for storage, sleeping on thin straw mattresses that were rarely changed and never properly cleaned. The single window, barely large enough for a cat to pass through, provided the only source of natural light. The daily routine began before dawn, when Constance Ellington would bang a metal pot with a wooden spoon to rouse the children from their sleep. There was no time for washing or personal care. The children were expected to be dressed and ready for work within 10 minutes of the wake-up call. Breakfast consisted of a thin gruel made from cornmeal and water, occasionally supplemented with a small piece of bread that was often moldy around the edges. Children who complained about the food or failed to finish their meager portions were denied the midday meal entirely. The work began immediately after breakfast and continued until well after sunset. During the harvest season, children as young as 6 were expected to work in the fields for up to 16 hours a day, picking apples, hauling water, and clearing stones from newly planted areas. Their small hands, ideal for reaching into tight spaces, were put to work cleaning machinery in the mill, a task that resulted in frequent injuries from moving gears and sharp metal edges. Timothy's first serious injury occurred in his 3rd week at the farm. While cleaning debris from around the mill wheel, his left hand became caught between 2 grinding stones. The injury crushed 2 fingers and left deep lacerations that became infected within days. Josiah Ellington's response to the boy's obvious pain and swelling was both swift and revealing. Timothy was locked in a small storage shed for malingering and given only water until he agreed to return to work. The boy was learning an important lesson about the consequences of carelessness, Ellington would later write in his private journal, a document that investigators would discover nearly 2 decades later. Coddling such children only reinforces their natural tendency toward laziness and self-pity. Hard work and discipline will make useful citizens of them if they prove worthy of survival. But it was the fate of a girl named Sarah Brennan that would first reveal the true horror of what was happening at the Ellington farm. Sarah, 10 years old, had been placed at the farm in August of 1829 after her widowed mother died of tuberculosis. She was a bright child with red hair and freckles, described by her placement worker as spirited but obedient, with a natural talent for needlework. Sarah had been at the farm for less than 2 months when she began showing signs of severe malnutrition. Her hair started falling out, her teeth became loose, and her skin took on a grayish pallor that worried even the other children. When Sarah could no longer perform her assigned tasks in the fields, Constance Ellington declared her a drain on resources and reduced her food rations even further. The child was moved to a smaller room in the cellar, away from the other children, where she spent her final weeks in almost complete isolation. According to later testimony from surviving children, Sarah's cries for help could be heard throughout the basement during her last nights, but any child who tried to bring her food or water faced severe punishment. Sarah Brennan died on October 15, 1829, becoming the first of many children who would never see their next birthday at the Ellington farm. Her death was never reported to any official authority. Instead, Josiah Ellington sent a letter to the Boston Placement Agency claiming that Sarah had been successfully relocated to a prosperous farming family in Ohio who were traveling west and could provide her with opportunities unavailable in Massachusetts. The letter was so convincing, so filled with details about Sarah's new life and the kind family who had taken her in, that the placement workers actually sent a note of congratulations to the Ellington farm, praising Josiah for his successful efforts in finding the child such a promising future. That night, by the light of a kerosene lantern, Josiah and Constance Ellington buried Sarah's tiny body in a grove of oak trees behind the farmhouse. It was the first grave in what would become a hidden cemetery containing the remains of 43 children who had simply vanished from official records, children who had trusted adults to protect them and instead found only exploitation and death. As autumn turned to winter in 1829, a pattern began to emerge at the Ellington farm that would persist for nearly 2 decades. Every few months, one or more children would mysteriously disappear from the roster, their absence explained by increasingly elaborate stories of adoption by westward-bound families. The surviving children learned not to ask questions about their missing companions, as curiosity was met with punishment that could last for days. Timothy Caldwell, the boy who had injured his hand in the mill machinery, managed to survive his first winter at the farm, but the experience left him fundamentally changed. His caseworker's notes from that first year described a transformation that would become tragically familiar. Timothy appears withdrawn and fearful during our visit. When asked about his education and daily activities, he responds in monosyllables and avoids eye contact. Mr. Ellington assures us that this is normal behavior for children adjusting to the discipline and structure of rural life. What the caseworkers didn't see were the daily realities that shaped Timothy's new personality. Children who spoke out of turn or failed to meet work quotas were locked in the root cellar for days at a time, sustained only by scraps of bread and dirty water. Those who showed signs of illness were isolated from the group until they either recovered enough to work or quietly died in the darkness of the basement storage rooms. The Ellingtons had developed a sophisticated system for managing their operation while maintaining the facade of a charitable institution. Constance kept meticulous records of which children were housed at the farm, but maintained two completely different sets of books. One set, available for inspection by state officials, showed reasonable numbers of children with detailed notes about their progress and eventual placement with adoptive families. The second set, hidden in a secret compartment behind the fireplace in Josiah's study, contained the truth: dates of death, causes of death, and locations of graves scattered throughout the property. The genius of the Ellington deception lay in its exploitation of the era's limitations in communication and record keeping. In 1835, there was no reliable way for officials in Massachusetts to verify whether a child had actually reached a family in Ohio or Missouri. Letters could be forged, and the vast distances involved made follow-up investigations prohibitively expensive and time-consuming. Moreover, the Ellingtons had cultivated relationships with local officials that made their operation seem not just legitimate, but exemplary. Josiah regularly attended town meetings in the nearby village of Hillsdale, where he was known as a prosperous farmer and moral citizen. He made generous donations to the local church and frequently spoke at community gatherings about the importance of providing guidance to unfortunate children who might otherwise fall into vice and criminality. Judge Marcus Fairfield, who served as the Justice of the Peace for Berkshire County during this period, would later admit to investigators that he had never questioned the Ellington operation because it seemed to be solving a genuine social problem. Mr. Ellington appeared to be doing the Lord's work, Fairfield testified in 1847. The children I saw during my occasional visits seemed well behaved and properly supervised. If their clothing appeared somewhat worn, or if they seemed thinner than one might expect, I attributed this to the healthy effects of outdoor work and simple living. But there were witnesses to the true conditions at the farm, people who saw beyond the carefully constructed facade that the Ellingtons presented to the outside world. One of the most significant was a man named Jacob Fletcher, a traveling tinker who regularly visited farms throughout western Massachusetts to repair cookware and farm implements. Fletcher's route brought him to the Ellington property 3 or 4 times each year, and his trained eye for detail began to notice disturbing patterns. The children I saw there were not like farm children elsewhere, Fletcher would later testify to investigators. Farm children are usually sturdy and quick to smile, eager to watch a stranger work and ask questions about the world beyond their home. The Ellington children moved like shadows, keeping their eyes down and speaking only when directly addressed. Their clothes were little more than rags, and I could see their ribs through the thin fabric. But what disturbed me most was the silence. A farm with 20 children should be full of laughter and calling voices. The Ellington place was as quiet as a graveyard. Fletcher's observations were particularly acute because his work required him to visit the farm during different seasons and at various times of day. He began to notice that the number of children seemed to fluctuate dramatically, but always in a downward direction. In the spring of 1834, he counted at least 18 children working in the fields. By his autumn visit that same year, he saw only 11. When he casually asked Josiah about the missing children, the answer was always the same: blessed with good fortune, placed with Christian families heading west. The phrase became so familiar that Fletcher began to think of it as Josiah's standard response to any inquiry about the children's welfare. But the tinker's suspicions deepened when he realized that in nearly 6 years of visits, he had never once encountered a child who appeared to be older than 12 or 13. In a normal household or institution, he should have seen the natural progression of children growing into adolescence and taking on more sophisticated responsibilities. At the Ellington farm, the children remained perpetually young, as if time itself had stopped within the property's boundaries. The summer of 1836 brought a drought that would test the Ellington operation in ways that previous years had not. The stream that powered the grist mill dropped to a trickle, and the usually lush pastures turned brown and brittle under the relentless sun. For most farmers in the region, the drought meant tightening belts and hoping for better weather. For the children at the Ellington farm, it meant starvation. With no mill income and failing crops, Josiah faced a crisis that threatened to expose his operation. His solution was as practical as it was horrifying. He would simply reduce the number of mouths to feed. Over the course of 3 months, 7 children died at the farm, their weakened bodies unable to survive on the handful of corn and occasional wild berries that constituted their daily rations. Among those who perished was Timothy Caldwell, the boy who had survived his first winter despite his injured hand. Timothy had grown into one of the older children at the farm, nearly 12 years old and showing signs of the physical strength that might have helped him endure harder conditions. Cold and showing signs of the physical strength that might have helped him endure harder conditions. But the combination of years of malnutrition and the additional stress of the drought proved too much for his developing body. He died on August 18th, 1836, in the same basement storage room where Sarah Brennan had spent her final days 7 years earlier. Timothy's death was particularly significant because he had been one of the few children who maintained contact with the outside world. His placement had been arranged through a Boston charity organization that required annual progress reports, and Timothy himself had been taught to write simple letters that were supposedly sent to his caseworker each Christmas. The letters, of course, were actually composed by Constance Ellington, who had developed considerable skill at mimicking a child's handwriting and vocabulary. When no Christmas letter arrived from Timothy in 1836, his caseworker, Mrs. Hartwell, began asking questions. Her inquiries led to the first serious investigation of the Ellington farm, though it would be another decade before the full scope of the operation would be revealed. Mrs. Hartwell's initial inquiry came in the form of a letter to Josiah, asking about Timothy's welfare and requesting confirmation that he was still thriving at the farm. Josiah's response was typical of his usual correspondence with officials: detailed, reassuring, and completely fabricated. He wrote that Timothy had indeed been placed with a devout Methodist family planning to establish a homestead in the Kansas Territory. The boy was reportedly excited about the adventure and had specifically asked that Mrs. Hartwell be told he was grateful for all her kindness, but ready to make his own way in the world. The letter should have satisfied Mrs. Hartwell's concerns, but something about its tone troubled her. In her experience, children rarely express such mature sentiments about leaving the only stability they had known. Moreover, Timothy had never mentioned any desire to travel west in his previous correspondence. Driven by instinct more than evidence, Mrs. Hartwell decided to make an unannounced visit to the Ellington farm. Her arrival on September 23, 1836, caught the Ellingtons unprepared for the first time in their 7-year operation. Constance was in the midst of preparing the evening meal, a thin soup made from potato peelings and scraps of fat, when she heard the sound of a carriage approaching the main house. Through the kitchen window, she could see an unfamiliar woman in city clothes stepping down from a hired buggy, her face set with the kind of determination that suggested this was not a social call. Josiah was in the fields overseeing the children's work when Constance sent one of the younger boys to fetch him. The child, a 7-year-old named Peter Hoffman, who had arrived at the farm only 3 months earlier, ran through the rows of withered corn plants with the desperate speed of a child who knew that delays in following orders resulted in punishment. By the time Josiah reached the house, Mrs. Hartwell had already begun asking questions that cut directly to the heart of their deception. "I would like to see Timothy Caldwell," she announced without preamble. "I've come a considerable distance and I won't leave without speaking to him directly." Josiah's response revealed both his quick thinking and his growing desperation. "I'm afraid that's impossible, ma'am. Young Timothy departed for Kansas Territory just last week with the Thornton family. They were most eager to reach their destination before the winter weather set in." Mrs. Hartwell studied Josiah's face carefully, noting the slight tremor in his hands and the way his eyes refused to meet hers directly. "That's curious, Mr. Ellington. Your letter indicated that Timothy had left with a Methodist family. Are the Thorntons Methodist?" The question caught Josiah off guard, revealing a small but significant inconsistency in his fabricated story. "Why, yes, of course they are Methodist. Most devout Methodist folk, the Thorntons. I misspoke in my letter when I failed to mention their name specifically." But Mrs. Hartwell was no longer listening to Josiah's explanations. Her attention had been drawn to the group of children visible through the parlor window, working in what remained of the vegetable garden. Even from a distance, she could see that these children bore little resemblance to the healthy, well-supervised young people that Josiah's letters had described. They moved with the slow, careful motions of people conserving energy, and their clothing hung loosely on frames that were clearly undernourished. "I would like to speak with some of the other children," Mrs. Hartwell said, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she used when dealing with uncooperative officials. "I assume you have no objection to my evaluating the conditions here, given that several of these children were placed through organizations with which I work closely." What followed was the first independent assessment of conditions at the Ellington farm, and the results were damning. Mrs. Hartwell spent 3 hours interviewing children and inspecting the facilities, and what she discovered horrified her. The children's living quarters were cramped, unsanitary, and clearly inadequate for housing even half the number of residents. The children themselves showed obvious signs of malnutrition and appeared to be suffering from various untreated medical conditions. Most disturbing of all, when she asked the children about their missing companions, their responses revealed a level of fear that no legitimate institution should have produced. When I inquired about Timothy specifically, Mrs. Hartwell would later write in her report, the children's reactions ranged from confused silence to visible distress. One girl, perhaps 9 years old, began weeping when I mentioned his name. When I pressed her for an explanation, she could only say, "He got sick and then he went away, but we're not supposed to talk about the ones who go away." Mrs. Hartwell's investigation marked the beginning of the end for the Ellington operation, though it would take more than a decade for the full truth to emerge. Her detailed report to the Massachusetts Board of State Charities documented systematic abuse and raised serious questions about the fate of children who had supposedly been placed with adoptive families. But the report also revealed the limitations of the era's social services system and the difficulty of pursuing investigations across state lines and territorial boundaries. The aftermath of Mrs. Hartwell's visit created a crisis that forced the Ellingtons to abandon their careful long-term strategy in favor of increasingly desperate measures. Within days of her departure, Josiah began making arrangements to close the farm's operations, at least temporarily. But the presence of 11 surviving children created a logistical problem that threatened to expose the entire operation. These children had witnessed years of abuse and had seen too many of their companions disappear to accept simple explanations about adoptive families. If they were transferred to other institutions, their testimony could trigger investigations that would ultimately lead to the discovery of the hidden graves scattered throughout the Ellington property. From Josiah's perspective, the children represented a threat that had to be eliminated. The solution he devised was both ingenious and monstrous. Over the course of the winter of 1836 to 1837, Josiah began spreading rumors throughout the local community that he was planning to relocate his entire operation to Missouri, where land was cheaper and the climate more suitable for year-round agricultural work. He spoke enthusiastically about the opportunities that awaited in the Western Territories and expressed gratitude that so many local families had benefited from his charitable work over the years. The cover story served multiple purposes. It explained why the Ellington farm would be closing, provided a plausible explanation for the family's departure, created expectations that they would be taking their remaining children with them when they left. What actually happened was far different. Between December 1836 and March 1837, all 11 remaining children died at the Ellington farm. The deaths were carefully spaced to avoid suspicion, typically occurring during severe winter storms when no outside visitors were likely to venture onto the property. Josiah's journal entries from this period, discovered years later by investigators, revealed the cold calculation behind each death. December 18th. The Hoffman boy has developed a persistent cough that disrupts the others' sleep. Isolated him in the root cellar until the cough resolves permanently. The winter cold should expedite matters. January 4th. Mary Sullivan continues to ask questions about Timothy and the others. Her curiosity makes her unsuitable for relocation. Have reduced her rations accordingly. February 22nd. Only 3 remain. The work of preparing for our departure to Missouri proceeds more efficiently, except for Josiah and Constance themselves. The house that had once echoed with the voices of dozens of children now contained only the silence of the grave. The carefully tended fields where small hands had labored for nearly 8 years reverted to weeds and wild grass. And in the oak grove behind the farmhouse, 38 small graves marked the final resting places of children whose names had been deliberately erased from official records. But the Ellingtons' troubles were far from over. Mrs. Hartwell's report had triggered a series of investigations that were slowly working their way through the state bureaucracy. Officials in Boston were asking increasingly pointed questions about the placement records from multiple institutions, and patterns were emerging that suggested systematic fraud. The investigation had begun to focus not just on missing children, but on the financial aspects of the operation and the possibility that state funds had been misappropriated. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Western Massachusetts intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. Moreover, the Ellingtons had made a critical error in their exit strategy. Their claims about relocating to Missouri were too specific and too public to simply disappear without a trace. Jacob Fletcher, the traveling tinker whose observations had first raised questions about the operation, continued to follow the story and began asking pointed questions about why no one had received word from the Ellington family since their supposed departure. Fletcher's curiosity led him to make inquiries with wagon masters and shipping agents who would have handled a family's relocation to Missouri. What he discovered was that no one matching the Ellingtons' description had booked passage west, and no wagons had been hired to transport their household goods to any western destination. The family had simply vanished, leaving behind a property deed that showed the farm had been quietly sold to a lumber company based in Albany, New York. The sale of the property provided the first concrete evidence that the Ellingtons had not relocated to Missouri as claimed. Court records showed that the transaction had been completed through intermediaries, with Josiah never appearing in person to sign the final documents. The purchasing company had been told that the owners were already in the Western Territories and could not return to Massachusetts to complete the sale in person. But Fletcher's most significant discovery came when he decided to visit the abandoned farm property in the summer of 1837. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his life and ultimately provide the evidence that would expose the full scope of the Ellington operation. Walking through the overgrown fields and examining the empty buildings, Fletcher noticed something that initial investigators had missed. The ground in several areas around the property showed signs of recent disturbance. Rectangular patches of earth that had been carefully leveled and replanted, but where the grass grew in slightly different patterns than the surrounding areas. Areas that looked, to Fletcher's experienced eye, exactly like graves that had been disguised to appear as natural landscape. Fletcher's discovery came at the same time that investigators in Boston were uncovering financial irregularities in the Ellington operation that suggested the scope of fraud was far larger than anyone had initially suspected. Records showed that over the 18-year period from 1829 to 1847, the Ellingtons had claimed subsidies for caring for nearly 200 children, while maintaining that most of these children had been successfully placed with adoptive families. The mathematics of the operation revealed its true horror. If the Ellingtons' claims were accurate, they had achieved a placement success rate that was virtually impossible given the realities of 19th century social services. More disturbing still, investigators could find no record of any adoptive family ever coming forward to acknowledge receiving a child from the Ellington farm. The break in the case came from an unexpected source, Constance Ellington herself. By 1847, 10 years after the couple had supposedly departed for Missouri, Constance was living under an assumed name in a boarding house in Hartford, Connecticut. The years since leaving the farm had not been kind to her. Josiah had died of pneumonia in 1843, leaving her with no income and haunted by memories that had begun to manifest as what her neighbors described as fits of religious mania. Constance's deteriorating mental state led to increasingly erratic behavior that eventually attracted the attention of local authorities in Hartford. She had begun attending multiple church services each Sunday, moving from one congregation to another, and delivering rambling confessions about children who needed forgiveness and graves that cried out for justice. Her landlord, Mrs. Catherine Morrison, became concerned enough to contact local ministers about Constance's behavior. It was Reverend Thomas Hayes of the Second Congregational Church who first recognized that Constance's confessions might be more than the ravings of a disturbed mind. During a particularly intense episode in March of 1847, Constance had grabbed his arm after services and whispered, "43 little souls, Reverend. 43 children who never got to grow up because we were too proud to admit we had failed them." Reverend Hayes carefully documented his conversations with Constance and eventually contacted authorities in Massachusetts, sharing his concerns that the woman might have information about missing children. The inquiry that followed led investigators to the abandoned Ellington property and to the discovery that would finally expose the truth about what had happened there. The investigation team that arrived at the former Ellington farm in September of 1847 included representatives from the Massachusetts Board of State Charities, the Berkshire County Sheriff's Department, and medical examiners from Boston. What they found exceeded their worst expectations. Using information provided by Jacob Fletcher and guided by Constance's increasingly detailed confessions, the investigators began systematic excavations in areas where the ground showed signs of previous disturbance. The first grave they uncovered contained the remains of a child approximately 10 years old, buried in a simple wooden box that had partially deteriorated over the intervening years. Wrapped around the child's body was a piece of cloth that bore the initials SB, later identified as Sarah Brennan, the red-haired girl who had been among the first to die at the farm. Over the course of 3 weeks, investigators uncovered 43 graves scattered throughout the property. The remains ranged from children as young as 6 to several who appeared to have been 12 or 13 at the time of death. Many of the bodies showed evidence of malnutrition, and several revealed signs of injuries that had never received proper medical attention. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from Josiah's hidden journal, discovered behind a false wall in the farmhouse basement. The journal contained detailed records of every child who had died at the farm, including their names, ages, dates of death, and Josiah's own assessment of the causes. The entries revealed a man who had gradually lost any sense of the children as human beings, referring to them increasingly as units and resources that had proven unsuitable for continued investment. The journal entries also revealed the true scope of the financial fraud. Josiah had continued to claim subsidies for children who had died years earlier, reporting them as still in residence and thriving under his care. In some cases, he had collected payments for the same child for more than 5 years after their death, creating false progress reports and correspondence that painted pictures of healthy, happy children growing into productive citizens. One of the most disturbing discoveries was a separate ledger in which Josiah had calculated the optimal mortality rate for maximizing profits while minimizing suspicion. According to his calculations, the death of approximately 20% of the children each year could be explained as natural mortality, while deaths of 30% or more might trigger investigations. The ledger showed that Josiah had deliberately adjusted food rations and working conditions to maintain what he considered an acceptable death rate. The confession that Constance provided to investigators filled in the final details of the operation and revealed the psychological transformation that had allowed two presumably normal adults to systematically murder dozens of children over nearly 2 decades. According to Constance, the first deaths had been genuinely accidental, children who had died from diseases or injuries that might have been survivable under better conditions. But rather than report these deaths and face potential criticism of their operation, the Ellingtons had chosen to cover them up. Once we had buried the first child in secret, Constance told investigators, we found ourselves trapped in a deception that grew larger with each passing month. Every new death forced us to create more elaborate lies until we were living in a world entirely of our own making. Josiah convinced himself that we were actually performing a service, removing children who were too weak or too troublesome to survive in the harsh realities of frontier life. But Constance's confession also revealed a more sinister truth, that the couple had eventually begun to view the children's deaths not as unfortunate accidents to be covered up, but as necessary business expenses to be managed. When resources were scarce, or when particular children proved difficult to control, they were simply eliminated. The operation had transformed from a charitable institution with a dark secret into a systematic murder enterprise disguised as child welfare. Constance Ellington was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, fraud, and conspiracy. Her trial, which began in the spring of 1848, attracted national attention and became one of the first cases in American legal history to focus specifically on crimes against children in institutional settings. The prosecution's case was built primarily on Constance's own confessions, the physical evidence discovered at the farm, and the detailed records that Josiah had maintained in his hidden journal. The defense argued that Constance had been dominated by her husband and had acted under his influence, pointing to her mental deterioration and religious obsessions as evidence of her remorse and diminished capacity. However, the prosecution countered with evidence from Josiah's journal that showed Constance had been an active participant in planning the deceptions and had often been the one to suggest reducing food rations or isolating sick children. The trial lasted 6 weeks and featured testimony from surviving witnesses, including Jacob Fletcher, Mrs. Hartwell, and several officials who had been deceived by the Ellingtons' elaborate fraud. Medical examiners testified about the condition of the remains found at the farm, painting a horrific picture of systematic neglect and abuse that had led to dozens of preventable deaths. On July 15, 1848, Constance Ellington was found guilty on 37 counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. She was also convicted of fraud and conspiracy charges that carried additional penalties. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, with several members later stating that they had wanted to recommend the death penalty but were swayed by evidence of her deteriorating mental condition. Constance served 12 years in the Massachusetts State Prison for Women before dying of tuberculosis in 1860. According to prison records, She spent her final years in a state of deep religious fervor, claiming to receive nightly visits from the spirits of the children who had died at the farm. Guards reported that she would often be found in her cell, carrying on conversations with invisible companions, apologizing repeatedly for unnamed transgressions, and begging for forgiveness. The Ellington farm property was eventually purchased by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and designated as a memorial site. A small cemetery was established in the oak grove where many of the children had been buried, with individual headstones bearing the names and ages of each victim. The inscription on the memorial reads, "In memory of 43 children who came seeking hope and found only suffering. May their sacrifice ensure that such horrors never occur again." But the legacy of the Ellington farm scandal extended far beyond the immediate punishment of those responsible. The case became a catalyst for the first comprehensive child welfare reform movement in American history, leading to the establishment of standards and oversight mechanisms that would influence social services for generations to come. Dr. Samuel Harrington, the official who had originally approved the Ellington operation, dedicated the remainder of his career to developing new protocols for institutional inspections and child placement oversight. In his 1851 report to the Massachusetts legislature, he wrote, "The Ellington case has taught us that good intentions and charitable purposes are insufficient safeguards against human corruption. We must create systems that assume the possibility of deception and build in multiple layers of verification and accountability." The investigation also revealed the broader scope of institutional abuse that had been hidden behind facades of Christian charity and moral improvement. Following the Ellington revelations, authorities discovered similar problems at several other private institutions throughout New England, leading to a wave of reforms that fundamentally changed how society approached the care of vulnerable children. Perhaps most significantly, the case established legal precedents that recognized children as individuals with rights deserving of protection, rather than simply as property or resources to be managed by adults. The concept of institutional accountability that emerged from the Ellington trials would later influence reforms in education, mental health care, and other areas where vulnerable populations were housed in controlled environments. The psychological impact of the case on the broader public was equally profound. For the first time, Americans were forced to confront the reality that systematic evil could exist within institutions that claimed to serve charitable purposes. The idea that trusted authority figures could exploit and murder children under the guise of providing care challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of social institutions and the reliability of official oversight. Jacob Fletcher, the traveling tinker whose observations had been crucial to exposing the operation, continued his trade for several more years, but was forever changed by his role in the investigation. In later interviews, he would say that the experience had taught him to look beyond surface appearances and to trust his instincts when something seemed wrong, even if he couldn't immediately explain why. "Evil rarely announces itself," Fletcher would tell audiences at lectures about the case. "It comes disguised as virtue, speaking the language of charity and moral improvement." The children at the Ellington farm died not because their caretakers were obviously wicked, but because those caretakers had convinced themselves and others that they were doing God's work. Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, whose persistent investigation had been the first crack in the Ellington facade, became one of the leading advocates for child welfare reform in Massachusetts. She worked tirelessly to establish new standards for institutional oversight and helped draft legislation that required unannounced inspections and mandatory reporting of child deaths in institutional settings. In her later writings, Mrs. Hartwell reflected on the systemic failures that had allowed the Ellington operation to continue for so many years. We created a system that prioritized bureaucratic convenience over child welfare, that trusted reputation over evidence, and that allowed geographic distance to excuse a lack of oversight. The children who died at that farm were failed not just by the Ellingtons, but by every official who chose to believe comforting lies rather than investigate uncomfortable truths. The physical remnants of the Ellington farm gradually disappeared over the decades following the investigation. The main farmhouse was demolished in 1852, and the fields reverted to forest as nature reclaimed the land where so much suffering had occurred. But the oak grove where the children were buried was preserved, and the memorial cemetery became a place of pilgrimage for those seeking to understand and remember the victims of institutional abuse. Visitors to the site often reported feeling an overwhelming sense of sadness and loss, as if the very ground itself retained the memory of what had happened there. Local residents claimed that the area never quite returned to normal, that even birds seemed reluctant to nest in the trees that had witnessed so much death and suffering. The records of the investigation, including Josiah's journal and Constance's confessions, were sealed by court order in 1850 and remained classified for nearly a century. When they were finally released to researchers in 1947, exactly 100 years after the discovery of the graves. The discovery of the graves provided new insights into the psychology of institutional abuse and the mechanisms by which ordinary people can become complicit in systematic evil. Modern scholars who have studied the case point to it as an early example of what would later be understood as organizational deviance, the process by which institutions gradually drift away from their stated purposes and develop cultures that normalize harmful behavior. The Ellington case demonstrated how isolation, lack of oversight, and financial pressures could transform a legitimate charitable enterprise into something monstrous. The case also highlighted the particular vulnerability of orphaned and abandoned children in 19th century America, a population that had limited legal protections and few advocates willing to speak on their behalf. The children who died at the Ellington farm represented a broader pattern of exploitation that extended throughout American society, wherever vulnerable populations were placed under the control of unaccountable institutions. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Ellington case was how completely the victims had been erased from official memory before the investigation began. These were children who had lived, laughed, hoped, and dreamed, but who had been reduced to false entries in ledger books and fabricated letters about fictional new lives in the Western Territories. Their deaths had been so thoroughly covered up that they had simply ceased to exist in any official sense, remembered only in the carefully hidden records of their killers. The 43 small headstones in the memorial cemetery represent more than just individual tragedies. They serve as a reminder of society's obligation to protect those who cannot protect themselves and to maintain vigilance against the corruption of institutions that claim to serve the common good. This mystery shows us that evil often flourishes not in dramatic acts of obvious cruelty, but in the quiet accumulation of small compromises and moral failures that eventually create systems capable of unimaginable harm. The Ellington farm was not the product of monsters, but of ordinary people who gradually lost their way and found themselves capable of acts they could never have imagined when they first opened their doors to homeless children. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Or do you think there might have been other institutions operating similar schemes during this period of American history? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about how we can prevent such tragedies from happening again. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The past has many more dark secrets waiting to be uncovered, and together we can ensure that these forgotten victims are finally remembered. See you in the next video.